13 October 1944, just after sunrise, US radar stations off Formosa picked up something they had never seen before: the largest Japanese air mass since the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Operators watched in disbelief as more than 80 aircraft merged into one enormous smear of green light sweeping toward Task Force 38, the most powerful carrier force the US Navy had ever assembled. And into that storm the Americans launched only 4 F6F Hellcats. At their head was Lieutenant Warren Lee Keely, a 24-year-old reserve pilot whose name didn't appear in any history book and whose combat record held nothing that predicted what he was about to attempt. The controller gave him a final vector that sounded more like a warning than an order. Large enemy formation, 80+, inbound. It was the kind of number that usually meant turn back, or die trying if you didn't. He understood exactly what that meant. Japanese Navy and Army air units over Formosa still had hundreds of machines to throw into the fight. Their strikes came in layers, torpedo bombers and level bombers in the center, fighters stacked above and outside to slash down on any defender who tried to get close. Somewhere in that radar blur were the aircraft that could gut a task group in minutes if they reached torpedo and bomb release. Somewhere above them waited the escorts, faster in level flight and eager to pounce on a handful of Americans rash enough to charge in. Doctrine offered a cautious answer: shadow the formation, wait for more US fighters, preserve your section for the next day's operations. Task Force 38 had been fighting for months. Every pilot and airframe mattered. But the situation off Formosa in mid-October 1944 left little room for caution. The Japanese were throwing back everything they had to break the American advance toward the Philippines. If even one large strike slipped through, cruisers and carriers could die in the span of a single radio call. Keely's instinct cut through all of that. Hellcats had the firepower and toughness to tear open a bomber formation if they struck from the right angle and did not hesitate. Hit the bombers first, hit them hard, and trust your wingmen to cover the rest. In the next few minutes, his decisions would decide not only whether 4 fighters made it home, but how many American ships still had flight decks by nightfall, and whether Japan would have any meaningful air shield left when the coming battle for Leyte Gulf began. When Warren Lee Keely left Arcadia, Oklahoma, there was nothing to suggest he would one day be steering 4 fighters into an 80-plane formation over Formosa. He was one more small-town American pulled into a global war. A farm kid turned aviation cadet standing in line with hundreds of others at naval air stations that seemed to expand by the month. Training aircraft rattled and shuddered as instructors drilled basic airmanship into young men who had never seen an ocean before. They crossed it. From there, the steps came fast. Primary trainers gave way to more demanding machines, then to carrier qualification with its pass-fail rhythm. Either a pilot learned to put his aircraft down on a moving strip of deck, or he washed out and went elsewhere in the Navy. Keely made the cut. By 1944, he wore the gold wings of a naval aviator and the silver bars of a lieutenant, assigned to Fighting Squadron 21 aboard Belleau Wood. His office was now the cockpit of a Grumman F6F Hellcat, the heavy-frame fighter that had replaced the lighter Wildcat as the backbone of American carrier air groups. On paper, the Hellcat gave him advantages that early war pilots could hardly imagine. Its 2,000-horsepower engine could haul the fighter past 370 miles an hour in a dive. 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns in the wings spat dense streams of fire that shredded the thin skins and unarmoured fuel tanks of most Japanese aircraft. Behind the pilot, armour plate and self-sealing tanks turned many would-be kills into damaged but recoverable aircraft. In squadron briefings, gunnery officers no longer talked about equal fights. They spoke instead about using American firepower to make every engagement uneven. Yet hardware alone did not explain Keely's path from student to division leader. The US Fast Carrier Force, Task Force 38, had spent 1943 and 1944 forging its fighter squadrons into hunting packs. Pilots flew interception drills, practiced high-side dives against simulated bomber streams, and learned to work in disciplined 4-plane sections where each man's first duty was to cover someone else's blind spot. Combat tours in the Gilberts, Marshalls, and Marianas burned those lessons in with tracer fire and flak bursts. By the time Belleau Wood joined the operations off Formosa, Keely was no longer a newcomer. He had watched Japanese naval air power break apart in the Philippine Sea, seen enemy formations that once inspired dread reduced to scattered wrecks. But he also knew that over Formosa, Japanese Army and Navy units still had hundreds of aircraft left, enough to threaten Halsey's Third Fleet and the landings planned for the Philippines. On 13th of October 1944, when the order came for VF-21 to launch a 4-plane division against an inbound strike, it was Keely's name on the board. 3 other pilots clipped into their harnesses, knowing that, for the next hour, their survival would hinge on his judgment. The first glimpse came as a blur, too many shapes against the morning haze to count at once. As Keely's 4 Hellcats closed the distance, the blur resolved into a vast layered formation, stretching across the pale sky over Formosa. Bomber wedges held the centre in rigid, disciplined blocks. Fighter specks floated above and outside, guarding the perimeter like wolves circling a herd. One wingman later admitted the sight made his stomach tighten. It was one thing to hear 80+ over the radio, and another to see an entire quadrant of sky moving toward you. This was where the abstract numbers from the radar screens turned into a physical fact. The division was closing on a force that outnumbered them at least 8-1. Vectored nearly 90 miles from the carrier group, they were far from friendly help. No additional fighters were close enough to reinforce them. Radar controllers aboard Belleau Wood and her sister carriers had done all they could. From here on, judgment belonged entirely to 4 men in 4 cockpits, making decisions at 300 miles an hour, while the formation ahead of them kept growing. Doctrine gave them options. They could shadow the formation, probe the edges, wait for more American fighters, but waiting was a luxury the carriers no longer had. If that bomber stream reached torpedo release range, cruisers and carriers could vanish beneath the waves in minutes. Keely set aside caution and chose the one move that gave 4 Hellcats a chance to hurt a formation this large: a high-side attack using altitude as a weapon. His division rolled in from above the bomber boxes, trading height for speed and surprise. In that instant, the geometry of the battle shifted. Gunners inside the Japanese twin-engine bombers twisted in their seats, struggling to track threats coming down steep from angles they weren't prepared for. Escorts drawn off by the sudden descent of American fighters peeled away from their protective perches. For a few seconds, the Japanese formation, designed for layered, coordinated defense, was momentarily dislocated. Keely aimed straight for the heart of the bomber stream. He didn't waste time with the long explanations over the radio. VF-21 had trained for this. Hit the bombers first, break the attack before fighters could close in, and trust the Hellcats' momentum to carry them through. As he squeezed into his first dive, the sun glanced off the formation in front of him. An entire Japanese strike group was about to feel the shock of 4 fighters using everything they had in the first few precious seconds. Behind him, the other 3 Hellcats committed fully. Nothing about the ratios favoured them, except the angle, the timing, and the discipline that had turned a handful of carrier pilots into a pack. By the time they punched through the top of the bomber formation, the battle had shed its neat geometry and become something raw and desperate. And now that the bomber line had been torn open, the Japanese fighters were diving to close the gap. If you're enjoying this story, hit like, share it with someone who also loves hidden chapters of history, and subscribe for more hidden stories of World War II. And after you finish the documentary, share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your take. The first bomber filled Keely's windscreen before his mind fully caught up to the speed of the dive. The F6F Hellcat shrieked downward, its big Pratt & Whitney engine howling as he lined up a Japanese twin-engine bomber, holding steady for its long run over the sea. Training dictated the next move: centre the target, fire short and precise, then brake before the gunners could adjust. 6 .50 caliber Brownings answered with a dense, violent stream of fire. The rounds tore into the bomber's wing root and engine nacelle, punching through metal that was never meant to absorb that kind of punishment. A moment later, oil and fuel erupted outward in a spray that ignited almost instantly. Flames rolled across the wing as the aircraft sagged out of formation, its nose dropping toward the far-off surface of the Philippine Sea. Keely didn't watch it fall. He was already rolling to line up another target. In those first seconds of the pass, the 4 Hellcats carved directly through the bomber stream. Japanese gunners tried to track them, but the steep angle and high speed warped their aim into useless guesses. The Navy Cross citation would later describe Keely's manoeuvring as maximum combat efficiency, a bloodless phrase for the split-second choices he now made. Hit engines, avoid long bursts, brake hard, right or left before the bomber's defensive fire found him. Another bomber flared in flames under his guns, then a third. Each kill was more than a single machine destroyed. It was an entire trained crew erased at a moment when Japan could not replace them. Wartime production could still build airframes, but trained aircrews, navigators, bombardiers, pilots, had become increasingly scarce by late 1944. Every bomber that fell from the sky took months of Japanese preparation down with it. Below and around Keely, his wingmen added their own scars to the formation. One Hellcat raked a bomber's tail until its left engine failed. Another clipped the wing of a second bomber, forcing it to drop out of line and spiral downward. In the span of a single pass, the tight Japanese formation collapsed into scattered groups. The carefully ordered bomber line was now a broken chain of burning wreckage, evasive turns, and disoriented pilots. But the cost of that disruption was coming. The escorts, Zeros and other late-war Japanese fighters, were diving now, trading altitude for revenge. They had let the Americans through once. They would not again. As Keely pulled back up through the thinning smoke, he knew the moment of advantage was over. What came next would not be a clean attack run. It would be a close-quarters fight for survival, fought at the edge of fuel, altitude, and time. The second phase of the battle began not with sound, but with motion. A dark blur sliding into Keely's peripheral vision as he clawed his Hellcat back toward altitude. Japanese fighters were finally diving in. Zeros and late-war interceptors, once perched above the bomber stream, now hurled themselves downward, determined to punish the Americans who had just torn open the heart of their strike. In an instant, the fight collapsed from altitude advantage, and controlled attack runs into a twisting, lethal knife fight, carried out at closure speeds that left almost no room for error. This was where the Hellcat earned its reputation. It lacked the Zero's famous turning, radius, but it carried something far more important in a chaotic melee: survivability. Armor plate behind the cockpit absorbed hits that would have torn through the fragile airframe of a Japanese fighter. Self-sealing fuel tanks turned potentially fatal punctures into manageable leaks, and the 650 caliber Brownings in its wings meant even a brief firing window, 1 second, half a second, could shred an attacker before he completed his pass. Keely's division moved as a single organism. In training, VF-21 had drilled the four-plane section until every pilot knew the angles and blind spots of the man ahead of him. Now those lessons paid off. When Keely pulled up and away from a bomber, his wingman slid underneath to guard the belly of his climb. When a Japanese fighter dove on a trailing pilot, the section leader rolled to intersect the attacker's path. No man fought alone, yet numbers still mattered. The Navy Cross citation would later list the day's tally in words that seemed almost unreal. 5 enemy bombers and 5 fighters destroyed, with a 6th fighter damaged. Claims made by a division that had been outnumbered 8-1. Keely himself accounted for 3 bombers. His division struck the fighters in the confusion that followed the shattered bomber run. Many of the Japanese pilots lacked the skill their predecessors had shown in 1941 and 1942. Poorly coordinated dives, rushed trigger pulls, and sloppy overshoots turned several of their attacks into easy targets for Hellcat guns. But victory came with a cost measured in fuel and ammunition. Every burst drained the belts, every climbing turn sucked irreplaceable gallons. Keely managed the swirling fight like a live equation. Hold the section together, slash at fighters recovering from failed dives, and never lose sight of the larger mission. Keep that shattered bomber formation from reforming and reaching the carriers. By the time the 4 Hellcats finally broke clear, the remaining Japanese strike was no longer a cohesive threat. Smoke trails marked the ocean. Scattered aircraft limped westward toward Formosa. The balance of numbers had been rewritten not by technology alone, but by the discipline of a section that refused to let the sky close around them. On strategic maps, the Formosa air battle is reduced to dates and arrows. October 12–16, 1944. Task Force 38 advancing, Japanese air units counterattacking. But the reality was 4 days of relentless pressure, a grinding clash between American carrier aviation and the remnants of Japan's once fearsome air arm. Formosa, modern-day Taiwan, became the crucible where that remaining strength was tested, burned, and finally broken. Keely's fight on October 13th was only a single node in a much larger storm. Over those days, Hellcats, Helldivers, and Avengers from multiple carriers launched wave after wave against Japanese airfields, shipping lanes, and communication hubs. Their mission was brutally direct: collapse the island's ability to project air power before American landings in the Philippines began. Japanese commanders responded with everything they could muster. Hundreds of fighters and bombers surged toward the American fleet in waves designed to overwhelm even the experienced pilots of Task Force 38. The statistics tell the rest. US sources record more than 300 Japanese aircraft destroyed over Formosa in just a few days. American losses, while significant, remained below 100. Runways were cratered, fuel depots set ablaze, and radio networks severed. By the third day, Japanese reconnaissance struggled even to determine the positions of Halsey's carriers, much less threaten them. The island's defensive shield, once considered a formidable barrier, was cracking under the combined weight of attrition and shock. But the effect radiated outward far beyond Formosa itself. Those aircraft and pilots had been earmarked to defend the Philippines, escort naval task forces, and protect the vital sea lanes that still tied Japan's empire together. Instead, many of them died in the waters east of the island, spent against the American carriers before the decisive battles had even begun. When the great fleets clashed at Leyte Gulf later that month, Japanese carriers sailed with skeletal air groups, so few aircraft on deck that they functioned more as decoys than strike platforms. Within that wider devastation, Keely's engagement stands as a microcosm of the strategy. 4 fighters charging into a vastly larger formation was not simply an act of personal valour. It was part of a deliberate campaign to grind down Japanese air power until it could no longer influence operations at sea. The chaos of that morning, the burning bombers, the scattered fighters, the broken strike, was one more fracture in an air defence system already stretched beyond recovery. The sky over Formosa did not break all at once. It broke in moments like these, where the outcome of a larger campaign turned on the decisions made by a handful of men in a sky thick with enemy aircraft. Some pilots returned to Belleau Wood that week with new kill marks on their cowlings, and stories that would echo through the ready room for months. Lee Keely did not walk down the flight deck with them. His Navy Cross, the award that captured the violence of his last fight, was issued posthumously. The citation praised superb airmanship and valiant fighting spirit in the face of grave peril, but between its carefully chosen lines sat the truth every naval aviator understood. He had pressed the attack past the point where survival was likely, and the ocean kept him. Belleau Wood herself kept fighting. In the weeks after the Formosa battles, her aircraft helped cover the Leyte landings, swept Japanese supply lines, and hunted surface forces during the sprawling naval clashes that followed. But the carrier would soon feel the war's shift into its most desperate phase. On October 30th, 1944, just 17 days after Keely's final mission, a kamikaze plunged out of the clouds and struck her flight deck with catastrophic force. The aircraft detonated among parked torpedo bombers, igniting aviation fuel that raced down the length of the ship in rolling sheets of flame. Damage control teams fought for every inch of steel. Men heaved burning Avengers overboard to keep the flames from spreading to the hangar deck. Others crawled through smoke-choked passageways to cut off the fire's advance. Propellant canisters burst in rapid succession, and the ship's structure groaned under the heat. But Belleau Wood survived, scarred, blackened, yet afloat, because her crew refused to let her become another name on the long list of carriers lost in the Pacific. By then, Keely's name lived mostly in the memories of squadron mates and a handful of typed lines in official paperwork. In Oklahoma, back on land he had not seen in years, his family received the news like so many others, by telegram. Later, his name appeared in a state historical bulletin. Lieutenant Warren Lee Keely, USNR, deceased, listed among Navy Cross recipients. It was a sparse summary for a life that had ended in a sky filled with fire and motion. The war's scale consumed many individual stories. Hundreds of aircraft launched daily from Task Force 38. Pilots briefed, scrambled, fought, and disappeared into the sea without ceremony. Yet inside ready rooms, where dents on gun barrels were traced with fingers, where kill tallies were discussed quietly rather than boasted, stories like Keely's were never just statistics. They were reminders of the narrow line between discipline and disaster, courage and loss. For the men who strapped into Hellcats during those final months of 1944, his example became a quiet measure, a standard. Proof of what one pilot could do when a sky thick with opponents left no room for hesitation. By the time American troops waded ashore at Leyte later that October, Japan's carrier air power had become a shadow of its former self. The elite aviators who had once crushed opponents across the Pacific were largely gone, lost at Midway, spent at the Philippine Sea, and finally drained in the skies over Formosa. When Japanese carriers sailed toward the climactic battles of Leyte Gulf, they did so more as bait than as strike platforms. Their decks, once bristling with aircraft, carried only thin symbolic air groups. The collapse did not begin in conference rooms or staff reports. It began in moments like the one Keely faced over Formosa, moments hidden in blurbs of citations and scattered across the logbooks of Task Force 38. When 4 Hellcats rolled into a formation 8 times their size, the macro and micro levels of the war intertwined. On paper, Keely's action reads as a statistic. 3 bombers destroyed personally, 5 bombers and 5 fighters eliminated by his small division, 1 additional fighter damaged. But war is not fought on paper. It is fought in the tightening of a pilot's breath as tracers rise toward him, in the weight of a throttle pushed forward when instinct says to pull away, in the knowledge that turning back means leaving a bomber formation free to carve into American ships already committed to the Philippine landings. For Keely and the men beside him, the decision was not abstract. It was immediate, physical, and irreversible. The Hellcat was a magnificent machine, durable, powerful, brutal when its guns found their mark, but machines do not choose to dive into impossible odds. Pilots do. They choose to trust their training, their wingmen, and the logic of a moment that turns suicidal ratios into narrow windows of advantage. Many historians later trace the unravelling of Japan's air defences to industrial attrition, training gaps, and resource collapse. All of that is true. But it also came apart in moments like this, where a handful of American pilots smashed into a formation that was supposed to overwhelm them. Strip away the strategy, and what remains is a silhouette. A lone fighter rolling into a sky crowded with enemies, engines howling, guns armed, no guarantee of return. Keely's silhouette vanished somewhere over the waters east of Formosa in 1944. His final flight swallowed by the vastness of the Pacific and the pace of a war accelerating toward its end. But as long as his story is remembered, not as a statistic, but as a human moment inside the chaos, the quiet truth of that morning survives. Sometimes the balance of a campaign shifts not through grand fleets or decisive conferences, but through what a small group of men chooses to do when they realize the enemy has the mate to won.